All right, sounds good. So we can go to the next chart, and I won't spend much time on this first chart because it's one that you already saw from Ned earlier today, talking about the benefits of the exploration strategy. So let's go to the next chart. So from an architecture perspective, we go all the way back to the NASA's Moon to Mars strategy and the objectives and goals and objectives defined in that strategy. And then we've established a process in which we iterate on an annual basis to evolve this strategy every year and reflect on it and keep moving through it. And so it's not a single point in time where we establish this. Like I said, it's on an annual basis and it's continually being looked at, and gaps are continually being identified. So if you go to the next chart, the architecture approach is based on three major tenets. We want an architecture that's traceable and decomposed from the objectives and all the way down to the architecture elements that NASA is working on. We want a framework in which we can ensure that there's relationships are understood and gaps are identified within the architecture. And then we also want processes and products to help provide clear communications in what we're doing. And how we do this is basically starting and ending with what we're calling our architecture concept review, a review in which the agency gets together on an annual basis. We present at an agency level the current architecture and how it's evolving and how it's decomposing, the gaps that we have identified in the architecture and those priorities to those gaps. We document that information, and then we bring it back again the next year to ACR and keep evolving through that process. So if you go to the next chart, I'm sure a lot of you guys have seen this. It's all about architecting from the right and the process that we're using for architecting from the right, decomposing those NASA Moon to Mars objectives down into the element functions and the mission use cases to help to establish the relationships of the executing programs, and also help to drive out gaps in the architecture and where our next elements need to be stood up to help maintain the Moon to Mars architecture. If you go to the next chart, I'm not going to go through a lot of details, but it is just providing you an example of the decomposition from the objectives to the characteristics and needs and use cases and functions into their mission use cases and element functions. And these are where we identify where we have gaps and what we need to work on next at the agency level, on what elements we need to do to continually evolve the architecture. So if you go to the next chart, we talk in the ADD about 4 architectural segments right now. Human lunar return. So those are the initial capabilities, the things you heard Ned and Mike talk about. Those initial systems that we're developing to help establish, the first human presence and the initial utilization for systems on and around the moon. Next, we have those foundational exploration segments that we're working on. And so this is helping to establish, that initial foundation for our lunar capabilities and for science and utilization. And it's also looking at Mars forward on things that we need to do on the surface of the moon to provide us a Mars forward capability. And then you get into the kind of the more things that are farther off and farther in the future, the sustained lunar evolution. So, and also then the human to Mars segments. And so those are farther out, but we're always looking at those sustained lunar capabilities and the human to Mars capabilities, leaning forward and making sure that we're closing the gaps in adequate time and appropriately so we can continue our work getting ourselves not only to the surface of the moon, but also to Mars. If you go to the next chart, we do have a set of sub-architectures within our architecture teams. I'm not going to read through these, but these are where we work the details of things like common nav and habitation systems and the mobility systems required to close the gaps in the architecture. So if you go to the next chart, so this is where we started off, and at ACR 23 on the left-hand side, we had those existing elements and existing capabilities we need for a human lunar return. And in ACR 23, we started establishing elements which are in our foundational exploration architecture. So things like the gateway, crew and science airlock module, the LTV, which we talked about, just releasing current contracts for that LTV vehicle, pressurized rover. So every year we're establishing new elements into the architecture and bringing those into our ACR products and establishing, the next step to closing out our Moon to Mars exploration. So if you go to the next chart, this is a little bit about the products that we produce. On the far left is the Moon to Mars architecture definition document. That's a very complex document. It's got a lot of information in it, but it is the primary product that we use to help establish and evolve on a yearly basis. Right now we're on revision A of the ADD. So in 2023 and 2024, we'll release revision B, but it's an evolving document. It's not a stagnant document, but it's updated annually on a 1-year basis. You can go and look at the Moon to Mars executive overview, which is like a 10-page summary of what's in the ADD. And then we also have a set of white papers. So this year we released 13 white papers, and those are on the far right-hand side. But the white papers help identify for the community where our priorities are, where our near-term gaps are, and the things that we are focused on helping to evolve and establish in the architecture near term. And every year we'll release a new set of white papers, and it'll allow the community to see where our focus is for the next year in development of the architecture. So if you go to the next chart, so what helps us inform our partnerships? So the first thing is the unallocated use cases and functions, things that aren't mapped to current systems or elements in the architecture, help inform where we need to focus and where we need some work in identifying and closing those gaps. The other thing that's out there is the human lunar return and foundational exploration segment descriptions in the ADD help include lists of open questions and integrated capabilities that the architecture team has defined. So if the community wants to see, where we see those open questions and where we see capabilities we need to fill that architecture, that's a good place to go look and understand, what we're thinking about and what we're talking about in those areas. And then, also we try to articulate more clearly in the utilization and science and technology opportunities in the ADD. So the ADD will be a good source for understanding what we're focused on for science and technology. So if you go to the last chart, so here we go back to those tenets, and the progress that we've made through this ACR approach. We've really worked to establish that traceability, providing you a blueprint of the objectives to the executing elements. We've developed the architecture framework in which we're establishing and ensuring relationships between the Moon to Mars objectives and the elements that we have defined in the architecture and how we're closing those gaps. And then we also have our processes and products that we have within the ADD and the white papers to help clearly communicate where we're going and what we're looking to, especially over the next year. And I think that's my last chart.